We have the European Union's ambassador to the Arctic coming up in just about half an hour's time. To take you through that session and the one coming up, I'd like to welcome Stephen Chase to the podium now. Stephen is the senior parliamentary reporter at the Globe and Mail. And the first guest that Stephen is going to be speaking to is one that I think is a crucial voice to this session, to this conference as a whole. We've heard Russia already talked about a lot. I don't know how many of us in the room feel like we're experts on what Russia is actually thinking, what it's doing. We hear a lot about it. I don't know how much we know. Luckily, there is someone to help us with that. So Stephen's first guest is the ambassador of Canada to Russia, joining us virtually this morning, and that is Sarah Taylor. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks very much. I hope everyone can hear me. Welcome to the morning session. We're very pleased to have Ambassador Sarah Taylor here. All my questions are going to be about what we don't know about the Canadian perspective in Russia, on the ground in Russia as it relates to the Arctic, and so on. So we'll get right to it. You're in Moscow, right? Are you right now, Ambassador?
No, in London.
There you go. Excellent. I wanted to ask you, from your position as our ambassador to Russia, can you just give us the Russian perspective on Donald Trump's push to acquire Greenland? Like, what are they making of all this?
Okay, very good question. Just before I get into the Russian perspective, I should say, of course, you know, the Canadian perspective, which was said very clearly by our Prime Minister, our strong support for Greenland's sovereignty and self-determination, and we were able to emphasize that in the recent opening of our new consulate in Nuuk. The Russians, ironically, have also spoken out in defense of Greenland's sovereignty and self-determination. I must say, ironically, of course, because meanwhile they're doing everything they can to counter Ukrainian right to self-determination. So I think it's one example amongst numerous of a degree of hypocrisy, if you like, in some of Russia's public statements. But what's more striking to me, actually, is that Russia has been, at senior levels, very quiet about that topic. They said they supported Greenland's sovereignty, but they have not been particularly vocal or critical at senior levels. And I think a lot of that is because for Russia, the overriding interest right now is trying to keep their relationship with the US and the US administration on fairly positive ground, especially in the context of the ongoing negotiations between Russia and the US and Ukraine, moderated by the US. So they've been remarkably restrained on that. And the final thing to say is, of course, I mean, they will not say this publicly, but I think it is hugely in Russia's interests if they see any division or sense of divergence of views within NATO. And so one of the very important things, I think, for us and for other NATO members is to make clear that we remain united, and including vis-a-vis Greenland and vis-a-vis the North.
It's been 4 years now almost since Russia launched its all-out assault on Ukraine, and I'm interested in how this has affected the people of the Russian North. Can you tell us about that? What is happening there, the casualty rates, the drafting of men? What do you see changing there?
Sure. I think this is something that it's not well known, but it's very important, is the majority of the Russians who have signed up to fight, and it is still something where people are signing up voluntarily in exchange for large sums of money, relative, sort of by local standards, very large sums of money. So because it's voluntary and it's financially driven, the vast majority of those who signed up are from poorer, remoter areas of Russia. So not just the North, but it includes the North. And so it's not targeting any particular ethnic groups or ethnic minorities, but the reality of that is, from what we're hearing, is that some of these northern ethnic communities, which are very small already, are then hugely affected because the majority of adult males are signing up and taking these very lucrative deals, going away to war, but then many of them being wounded or injured. And so the demographic impact longer term on these communities that are already struggling with preserving culture and language and sense of identity I think is going to be really huge. So that's part of, I mean, we see a very long tail to this war, whatever happens in the short term. And I think that will be one part of the long tail, is this enormous impact on these minority communities.
This hollowing out of these communities.
Absolutely.
The other aspect of the war is that Russia is using all its military resources to prosecute what it thought was going to be a 3-day jaunt. And so they have diverted much of their economy, but also much of their war machine and their military resources to Ukraine. What does this mean for their presence in the North and in the Arctic across all branches?
Yeah. So big distinction there, I'd say, between strategic and the more conventional forces. So conventional forces, the Army and Air Force forces that were in the North have now been very hollowed out because they need to throw everything they can at Ukraine. So that has seen a real decrease in presence. The only exception on the conventional side is the Navy, because there isn't really much naval role now for Russia in the war in Ukraine. So that has changed significantly. On the other hand, a large segment of Russia's strategic capacity is in the north, deliberately. And that has, not only has that not changed, but in some areas that is increased, because what we've seen is after the so-called Operation Spiderweb, where the Ukrainians were able to mount drones on trucks and send them way into the interior to attack some of Russia's strategic air force. They have now moved more of that strategic air capacity into the north, I think just to keep it further away from Ukrainian reach.
We talked yesterday at the conference about whether China poses a military threat in the Arctic. I've always thought of it more as China bankrolling Russia's development in the Arctic and playing a larger and larger role there. So I wanted to talk about Russia's dependence on Chinese capital to fund development of its far north, energy projects, infrastructure, Northern Sea Route capacity. What does that look like from the Russian side? Where do you see the Chinese building a footprint?
Yeah, so I think the two aspects to that. One, the military, as you said, and the strategic, and then the other, the economic. And on the military and security side, I don't think the Chinese necessarily have particular military interest in the Arctic per se, but on the other hand, they are very clearly providing a large amount of dual-use technology to the Russians. So they're important enablers of Russian military capacity and have a kind of behind-the-scenes role in the war in Ukraine, which we and others raise with them and raise our concerns about. But the big interest, I think, for China in the north is economic. And what that really translates into right now is mainly oil and gas shipments from the Russian north to China. So an increasing, with sanctions, an increasing percentage of Russian oil and gas production is going to China, and quite a bit of that through the Northern Sea Route. But you're absolutely right that to develop this more and to develop other capacity in the north, Russia needs investment. It's a very expensive undertaking, and they don't have enough government funds, especially, again, given the pressures of the war. But the interesting thing there to me is actually they have not been able to attract very much Chinese investment. So Chinese are happy to buy their oil. Chinese are trying to test shipping cargo through the Northern Sea Route, but actually investing in ports or other on-the-ground infrastructure on the Northern Sea Route, so far, Chinese are not really interested.
I wanted to ask you about the recent visible increase in Russian Chinese military cooperation in the North Pacific and the Arctic. We're talking about the joint patrols off the Bering Sea. Can you explain this? What's happened here? Why is this happening?
Yeah. So I think the main thing that you're referring to, and that a lot of people took notice of, was that there was a joint incursion into the American ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone off Alaska last year. And it was a Russian bomber and Chinese bomber flying side by side. So that was certainly something new and different. And moreover, the Chinese bomber had actually gone to Russia first and flown from there. So on the one hand, it's new, but on the other hand, I would say it's as much symbolic as actual. And what those with more expertise than me on the defense side tell me is there isn't really interoperability there. It's not like, say, some NATO exercises where we're really working directly together with other armed forces. The planes fly side by side, the Russian and Chinese planes, but that they're not actually, beyond that, they're not doing much together. And also that from the US perspective, the US was aware of the incursion. Russian incursions happen fairly frequently around that area. And we're able to intersect the bombers and escort them back out of the ADIS. So I'm left feeling I wouldn't discount it, but I think the importance is much more symbolic and about signaling. The Russians and the Chinese side sort of wanting to signal about both their cooperation and their unhappiness. But what it means in terms of actual capacity, military capacity to do things together, I think we should be careful not to overblow that.
Yeah, you're saying it looks a bit performative as opposed to
Yeah.
substantial. Can I ask about the sea cooperation, though? I was actually thinking more of that. We're talking about these joint exercises, the Beaufort areas, Chukchi, and the Arctic.
Yeah.
Again, is that the same thing? Is it performative, or is there something more going on there? And what does it mean for Canadian security?
Yeah, I think, again, still important to look at. My understanding even there is those exercises are much less about interoperability and more generally, a lot of because Russia does other exercises elsewhere with a number of other players as well as China. And those are sort of about sailing side by side, but they're not about actually being a unified fighting force. So I think for Russia right now, it's about demonstrating, hey, we have friends. But it's not the beginning of some sort of Russian equivalent of NATO. So again, I'd say it's more on the signaling side and the diplomatic side almost rather than about military capability. I think it's very important for Canada to keep an eye on this, and that's a region that's important strategically, but also from a fisheries perspective. And so we need to have an awareness of what's happening there.
As somebody who represents Canadian interests in Moscow, I want to ask you about the threat from Russia. People talk about protecting the Arctic from Russia. What are the concrete acute threats as you see them in the short term and longer term? Are we talking about territory? Are we talking about bomber and missile posture or something else?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think just broadly, one of the challenges for all of us, I mean, both in government and in the think tank community and elsewhere, is getting a right balance. I mean, we need to understand, what's real and what's changing. And obviously, Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine has dramatically changed the strategic context. But we also need to avoid falling into that sort of Cold War era where we actually, I think, overestimated Russian power and capacity. So I would just say, conventionally, I actually don't really see any great threat, or certainly no change in Russian threat posture in the Arctic. I mean, if anything, the reverse, because as I said, a lot of their conventional capacity has all been thrown at Ukraine. The issue is more the strategic context. And even there, I'm not saying it's like, suddenly the Russians are going to be, using nuclear weapons in the Arctic, in the north. But I think we do see, so there's a more hostile diplomatic environment because of the war in Ukraine. There's the end of the New START treaty, which is not a good development. There are changes in technology that mean that things that weren't possible before in terms of how far you can launch an ICBM from, or how far you can launch a nuclear missile from, those are changing. And undersea technology, ability to attack by stealth. So that technological change is important. We need to pay attention to it, and it's not captured. I mean, START is no longer, but even if we had START, it wouldn't be captured by those sort of older era agreements. And the final thing, of course, is climate change and the impact of climate change in the Arctic, which is making a lot of people look at it more closely. And again, I think changing a bit of the strategic dynamic. So to me, all that says we need to be very watchful, and we need to think about our own capacities in this regard, and we need to encourage, if not the return to START, at least some other form of discussion and structures around disarmament and arms control. But again, at the same time, I wouldn't want to over-exaggerate the degree of threat or the degree of capacity there.
Yeah, no, in the same way that the People's Liberation Army conducts exercises in the Taiwan Strait, people have pointed out it's not so much a message for Taiwan, it's a message for the U.S. I think that some ways the behavior in the Arctic is not a message for us more than our southern neighbor. I have more questions, but we've got about 11 minutes left. Does anyone have questions first before I continue? If you don't, I'll just keep going. I don't see anybody in the room who's got questions, so I will keep going. I wanted to ask you about the sort of timeline and status of Russia and Canada's overlapping claims on the extended continental shelf under UNCLOS. How do you see this contest over the North Pole evolving? Is this a 5-year issue, 10-year issue, 15-year issue, 20 years?
I'm not sure I'd want to tie myself to a timeline. I think that's always risky, but you may know, I mean, Canada put in some time ago a partial continental shelf claim, but we have another claim, in addition to that claim, that is in the works and has been for some time. So I don't want to put too much pressure on my legal colleagues in our headquarters on when that's going to be done, but it is underway. And then similarly, the Russians have a continental shelf claim as well. And I think the reality there is that already I think there is some overlap between our claims, and that when the additional claim is put in place by Canada, the chances are good that there will be quite a bit of overlap. So that will be something where we have a difference of views, a legal dispute, if you like. At the moment, I don't think that's necessarily going to feature very prominently in our relations. And the impact of the war in Ukraine is so much greater on relations that a legal dispute under UNCLOS is going to be at still very important for the long term, but not as hot a dispute, if you like. But I do think it's important because it reminds us both that we and Russia are the two biggest pieces of real estate in the Arctic. So we have a lot at stake, both of us. And it's also a useful reminder that there is a legal regime that covers the area. And I think sometimes, not so much for the Russians, but for some of the other players like the Chinese, it's important to keep reminding everybody that this is not some sort of diplomatic blank slate, that there is a strong international law regime that covers the Arctic and manages the Arctic because it's sea, not land, unlike the Antarctic, and that we need to use that structure to manage disputes in the future.
I want to bridge from that to the next question, which is China calls itself a near-Arctic state, which I guess by that rule, Spain could claim that as well. So do Canada and Russia have any shared interest in insisting that Arctic is governed not like a second Antarctica or not a common heritage zone, but in fact the domain of those who front the Arctic?
Yeah, I think potentially, yes, that is an interest. I mean, I'd still say our approaches to it are a bit different, but certainly that one of the driving ideas behind, for instance, the Arctic Council, which Canada led the foundation of, was that the Arctic states should be the prime movers, along with Arctic peoples, of the governance and decision making of the region. So now you have, I mean, China, but also a number of other countries expressing interest in the Arctic and developing Arctic policies. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but it's more a question of then what does that actually look like and translate into? And yeah, I'd say the one concern I have somewhat about the Chinese approach, and it's not their official stance, but some voices in China talk more about, seem to compare the Arctic to the Antarctic, and as you said, like a sort of common heritage space that should be governed by all. And that's not recognizing that it's not land, it's sea. And as I said, we have a regime that governs that under UNCLOS. Maybe the last thing just to add on that front is, of course, one other thing that has changed the strategic environment quite a bit is, again, because of Russia's aggressive attack on Ukraine, that has driven exactly the opposite of what Russia says it wants, which is an expansion of NATO. So Finland and Sweden have joined NATO. And so that actually means that now all of the circumpolar nations, except Russia, are NATO members. And so that does change the dynamic a little bit in terms, I think, of the level of interest and attention to the Arctic in a NATO context.
Can you compare and contrast the Russian approach to commercial traffic through the Northern Sea Route versus the Canadian approach to commercial traffic through the Northwest Passage?
Yeah, it's quite different, and I'm sure many people in your audience are much more expert on this than I am. But just if you look at the geography, it's very different. I mean, we have hundreds of islands and this very complex landscape to traverse for the Northwest Passage. The Russian Arctic coastline is much simpler and has just a few small islands. So in principle, from a land perspective, it's more straightforward. Of course, I mean, the big challenge in both instances is the ice, not the land for navigation. And I saw recently the commander of the Royal Canadian Navy made, I think, a very good point, which is that melting ice makes navigation harder, not easier. So there's this sense of, oh, the Arctic is melting, therefore we can all start sending ships through. No, it's actually much tougher to do that. And I would say, I mean, there's not a lot, I mean, except at a theoretical level, nobody's really trying, as far as I know, to send container traffic through the Northwest Passage. They are doing a little bit of that on the Northern Sea Route, but I think even that gets overblown, some of the reporting on it. I mean, China last year, for the first time, sent an experimental container ship through ice-capable container ship through the Northern Sea Route and onwards. But that was a one-off, and everything I hear suggests that for cargo, at least, that the Northern Sea Route is decades away from being a major route. So I think the Chinese, as they are wont to do, they are very much long-term thinkers and planners. And so they may be thinking out to 2030, 2050, something like that. But right now, neither the Northwest Passage nor the Northern Sea Route are viable really on any major scale for cargo. And most of what's going through the Northern Sea Route is oil and gas in tankers from Russia to China. And that's the main traffic.
I'd just like to give you a chance for a last word on the future of Canada-Russia relations as it relates to the Arctic. And I was intrigued by in our pre-interview, our discussion about the graves in Russia and, of course, the history of the World War II Arctic convoys. So I've sort of given you an invitation to say whatever you want to say about the future of Canada-Arctic relations, given our historical roots as well.
Well, thanks. And yeah, I think one of the messages we try and put across as much as we can in Moscow is that while we have a profound dispute with the Russian government about the war in Ukraine, we're not against the Russian people. We're not, despite what some Russian propaganda says, we're not Russophobes, and we, value and remember both current and past links, people to people ties. And one of the things that really brought that home to me, we discussed before, was I've now been twice to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, where there are Canadians buried in war grave cemeteries. Some from the First World War, Revolutionary War, so that's another interesting, maybe less happier history, but also from the Arctic convoys. And there are a local group in Arkhangelsk, especially, who are very interested in the convoys, who tend those graves, who remember all these, very young, often sailors, merchant mariners from the UK, from the US, from Canada, who died bringing food in to break the blockade of Leningrad, and also food into Arkhangelsk. And I remember one man I met in that context telling me about his father as a young boy in Arkhangelsk, and they were starving at the time. They had almost nothing to eat. And suddenly having bread, white bread made from wheat that had come in from Canada on one of these convoy ships, and how this marked him, that he had this memory of eating this Canadian bread all his life. So when things are not looking good in terms of the relationship, I do like to remember also that there are those human connections and that historic connection, and that we are both very much, northern countries for whom our Arctic space is a core national interest. So that is maybe something we have in common, is that we are the two countries for whom really the Arctic is a core part of our national identity and our national sovereignty. So I hope that at some point in the future, the war will end, hopefully soon, and that maybe then there is scope to go back and revisit some of those connections.
Thank you very much for your time, and wishing you a good night there in London.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thank you for letting me join you virtually.